Welcome to you. Welcome back. Jerry from Wisconsin, Steve from what looks suspiciously like the diocesan offices, and Lisa from Palmerston North. And to give you some sort of sense of where we all are, I'm in cloudy Kapiti at Raumati Beach. Lovely to be together in this disparate way and to be speaking across the miles of the same passage in Luke 10. To which, Jerry, I think you have some background.
This is probably the easiest background assignment I've ever had, because everybody knows this parable, the Good Samaritan, and everybody knows the basic background, which was that the Jewish people didn't like the Samaritans. The historical background to that is that the Samaritans were very like the Jews, but not quite. And we do seem to have more trouble with those who are nearly us than those who are quite different. They they had the Torah, but they had their own version of it. And they had nothing to do with the Jews. And they furthermore interpreted the sacrifice of Isaac as having taken place in Samaria instead of on Mount Zion as the Jews interpreted it. And so in many ways, the Samaritans held a position to the first century Jews similar to that of Muslims and Jews today. Similar book, but different, and even a different interpretation of that story about the sacrifice of Isaac. So they really didn't get on, and they were much worse than Gentiles because they were almost right. The other bit of context I would add is that this is one of those parables that is only found in the Gospel of Luke. And one of the distinctions of the Gospel of Luke compared to the other Gospels is a very heavy emphasis on service and love for the poor and not much hope for the rich. Luke was fascinated with outcasts and those who had been excluded. So this is all about the outcast.
I wouldn't find that challenging until I realized that we in the global north, the west, whatever we want to call it, aren't exactly the poor, are we? So we might tease that out a little in a few minutes. But let's go to you, Steve. Let's go to challenge instead of good news, because obviously there's some challenging stuff here.
Yes, this is a challenge. And I couldn't agree with Jerry more that this is a story which everybody knows, until I was at my nurse this morning having a vaccination. And she said, "What are you doing this afternoon?" I said, "I'm meeting up with someone in the States and some of the North Islands, and we're having a Zoom meeting." "Oh, what's it about?" "It's about the Good Samaritan." Blank face, no idea. What's the Good Samaritan? Mm-hmm. This is an Indian-based nurse. And so the challenge for me first is, what is so fresh and embedded in my own experience possibly isn't nowadays for everybody. So that was just the smallest challenge. The next challenge is the enormity of this story. My good news was this is a story and not a doctrine, which is fantastic. But the challenge about it is this is something both temporarily and in a sense geographically is huge, because we've got something which is, who is my neighbor in the short term, the medium term, and the long term. And so I might be really good at the short-term business. Yeah, I can go over. I'm not frightened of someone lying in a pool of blood. That's just a gift I've got. But I'm not so good at nursing somebody through a long-term thing. Jesus says, actually, they're both. And then there's not only the short and the long, there's that bit in the middle where you're getting a bit bored and you want to move on. So there's that. And then there is the challenge that, well, who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Because I'm still having to ask myself that question. Who is my neighbor? Because I would quite like to define, get it sorted out once and for all, and then I find it turns around and hits me again. So those are the challenges that I've just dealt with.
How does that resonate with you, Lisa?
Yeah, very much so. I think the thing to think about as well is that this story is, all too possible today. So I don't know if you're aware of it, but there was a case in France recently where a famous Swiss artist whose name was René Roberts fell on the streets in Paris on a cold winter's evening, and hundreds walked past him and no one stopped until a homeless man called emergency services. But this artist died of hypothermia, and it sent France into a kind of dilemma about, are we a caring community? His friends said that he died of indifference. And I think we'd like to think we would be different. But the whole point of this story, and I'll come back to this, is it almost forces us, if we think about who we identify with in this story, we can't easily identify with the Samaritan. So we have to think about ourselves as the people who walk on by, and how easy that is to walk past someone who's not like us. You know, it's easy for us to empathize and be compassionate to those around us who we know or identify with, but somebody who is not us presents us with some real challenges. I think that's what Jesus is doing here. And I think that doesn't just relate to people on the side of the road. There could be people closer to us at work or at home, in our families or church communities, who, because they're different or because they're not us, we walk by and are ignoring their distress. I think there's a challenge in there.
And we're talking as a bunch of able-bodied Caucasians for a start. So immediately you've got these othernesses creeping in. Jerry, let's go back for you for the challenge.
How many of you have seen rewritten versions of this, updated? I've probably seen 4 or 5. I've got a sermon myself in which most of the sermon is just retelling the story, and I have a conservative Muslim and a liberal Muslim stepping over the man lying in the street for their various reasons, all very involved in their very important spiritual duties, and a Muslim medical student running over and helping and getting him to the hospital. So it's so easy to update, but again, what's hard to do is to convince ourselves that we're the Samaritan. Yeah. It's so much easier to imagine me being too preoccupied or too frightened.
Yeah, so we're all finding quite a challenge, but let's have good news, because we want to end the day with hope. Back to you, Steve, for the good news.
Yeah, I'll go back to that it is a story, and that I hope that when we go away from our sermons, there is a sense of good news, and stories stick in our minds so much. Interestingly, yes, I think that, do we identify as a Samaritan? But just thinking, who is Jesus in this story? Because at one level, we see a man who is stripped, beaten, and left half dead. Then we don't have to look very far on in Luke, and we see this happening to Jesus. And so are we able to see someone who is stripped of all identity? There's nothing that's partisan about this, but actually someone who is open for all of us. Or is Jesus the Samaritan, the one whom we've chosen to ignore, but the one who comes and rescues us when we are stripped, lost our identity, and lost our capacity? So the good news, I think, is that this story is there, it's relevant for today, and I think it still happens today, even though notwithstanding in a French city with a Swiss diplomat or whoever it was, that it can pass. But for us, there is that reminder that someone has come and found us when we are lying, waiting and wondering what might be happening.
Jerry, good news?
One thing that I see good news in is that there's no difficulty in interpreting this. Even the people that Jesus was speaking to, he said, now, who was a neighbor? And even they said, oh, it was a Samaritan. Except they couldn't say the word. The one who stopped, that one. We recognize that care for the one in trouble is right. And one of the things that Jesus does is he jars us into recognizing what we do at heart know, that love is better than whatever it was that was keeping us preoccupied as we went down the road. And so the good news is that Jesus, while he shows a certain amount of skepticism as to whether some people will stop, calls us to be the one to stop and has hope for us.
And for you, Lisa, resonating with you again, good news?
I love the clarity of this story and the beginning, the thing that sparks the story. And, Jesus is often quite cryptic, but here he is super clear. And so, thinking about what initiated all this, he says really clearly, what do we need to live? And he says, just love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and strength and mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. That's it.
Well, that's easy then.
Oh, that's okay then. But you know what I mean? It's clear. This is a challenge and hard, but it's really clear. This is what we've got to do. So that's one piece of good news, that clarity. But the second one is actually picking up on something that Steve said. I think in any congregation listening to this familiar story being read, there will be some people who identify with the man on the side of the road, that they feel abandoned and stripped and broken and ignored. And I think the great news in here is the Good Samaritan is coming down the road. He is the man who was ignored and marginalized, but he's on his way. Jesus is on his way, and he'll come in unexpected ways. And when we're in that position, all we have to do is wait and be lifted onto that donkey. And I think that's a really important thing to say.
Thanks, Lisa. Let's now apply it in the world around us. And Steve, if I can get you to kick off this one, the so what?
So what? Yeah, so what? The lawyer asked what he thought was, I think, a erudite and clever question, and he got a much wider and more challenging answer. How ready am I to hear that answer today?
Thank you. Jerry, so what as we face this challenge?
The so what is immediately to look around at my world to see who is left behind, who is ignored, who is being forgotten. And immediately I think of the epidemic that we had long before COVID-19 and that was ignored then and was ignored all the way through the pandemic and is still being ignored, of drug abuse. And we lose 1,000 people a day to drug addiction in America. No one knows what to do. And so it's been swept under the rug. And I wonder what we as a church can be doing.
And of course, it's so easy when you see a person who's showing the signs, the outcomes of drug addiction, just to move by to that other pavement, that other sidewalk for you, but so easy just to distance ourselves. And I think too often we do. And Lisa, the so what from you?
Yeah, so my so what was similar to Jerry's, the question of whose distress am I ignoring now and what excuses am I giving? But I was putting it much closer to home in terms of the person I walk past. So I go back to that idea, who is the person at work? Who is the person in my family? Who is the person in my church? And I was actually really confronted when I thought about this, because I realized there's somebody at work who is actually deeply, deeply unhappy. But because that person is really different to me and I don't naturally warm to them, I've just kind of left them to it. And I've been thinking, actually, I've been the Levite or whatever, how am I called to care for that person who is close to me, whose distress I'm ignoring? And, I think this is a difficult and uncomfortable question, but I think what's wonderful about it is that it stretches and grows our sense of who is our neighbour and what it means to love.
So a familiar passage, even to many today, if not all, as Steve has reminded us, but breaking it open together, finding new truths, even just around our metaphorical table here. Lisa, Jerry, Steve, thanks for joining me, and it's been tremendous to explore the Samaritan once again. Thank you.